The sun hung low over the treetops of Willow Creek, a quiet suburban enclave where the lawns were trimmed to perfection and the houses stood like sentinels of order. For James Carter, a retired Army veteran, this neighborhood had once seemed like a sanctuary, a place where the chaos of war could finally fade into the background. He had served VY-VED 2 tours in Iraq, dodging IEDs and sniper fire, carrying the weight of fallen comrades in his heart. When he bought the modest 2-story home on Elmwood Drive 3 years ago, he thought he'd found peace. The silence of the streets, the rustle of leaves in the breezite was a stark contrast to the relentless noise of combat. But peace, it turned out, was an illusion, and the real war was just beginning. James wasn't naive. He knew his scars weren't just physical. The jagged line across his left forearm from shrapnel was nothing compared to the VY Cybele wounds PTSD that woke him in a cold sweat, heart pounding as if mortars were still exploding nearby. He'd learned to manage it, mostly long walks at night when the nightmares clawed at him, deep breaths when a car backfired too loudly. He kept to himself, not wanting to burden anyone with the baggage he carried. But in Willow Creek, solitude wasn't an option. The Homeowners Association ruled with an iron fist, and its president, Richard Vance, was a man who thrived on control. Richard was the kind of guy who wore pressed khakis and a perpetual smirk, the self-appointed king of a kingdom he'd built on petty rules and intimidation. To him, James wasn't a hero who'd serve his country. It was a glitch in the system, a crack in the pristine facade of Willow Creek. It started small, a note about James's mailbox being slightly off color, a complaint about the way his truck parked an inch over the line. James fixed them without a fuss, chalking it up to neighborhood quirks. But then the complaints escalated, each one more absurd than the last. His porch light was too harsh. His recycling bin lingered curbside 10 minutes too long. A single dandelion dared to sprout in his yard, earning him a $50 fine. It wasn't about the rules, it was about him. The tension came to a head at a monthly HOA meeting in the community center, a sterile room with fluorescent lights and rows of folding chairs. James had been summoned with a vague notice, no explanation attached. He sat near the back, hands clasped tightly, his broad shoulders hunched as if bracing for an ambush. The room buzzed with the usual chatter fence heights, noise levels until Richard took the podium, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "We've had some concerns raised about a certain resident," Richard said, his tone laced with mock concern as he turned his gaze on James. "Mr. Carter, we understand you got some personal challenges." He paused, letting the words hang like a noose. "Maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere else. Somewhere your episodes won't disturb the peace." A ripple of laughter spread through the room, some nervous, some cruel. James felt heat crawl up his neck, his fists clenching until his knuckles whitened. "I'm not bothering anyone," he said, his voice low but steady, a soldier's discipline holding it together. Richard's smirk widened. "Not yet. But PTSD? That's unpredictable. Maybe Willow Creek isn't the right place for someone like you." He leaned forward, eyes glinting with triumph. "Ever thought about a cabin in the woods? Might suit you better." The room went quiet, the kind of silence that presses down like a weight. James stood, his chair scraping against the floor, and walked out without another word. Outside, the night air hit him like a slap, but it couldn't cool the anger simmering in his chest. He'd faced enemies before, men with guns, men who wanted him dead, but this was different. These were his neighbors, and they'd turned him into a pariah. The harassment didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, the HOA's campaign intensified. Notices piled up on his doorstep. His wind chimes were disruptive, his late-night walks suspicious. Neighbors who'd once offered polite waves now crossed the street to avoid him. One evening, a group of kids egged his garage door, their laughter echoing as they ran off into the dark. James scrubbed it clean before dawn, not wanting Richard to have the satisfaction of another complaint. But the final blow came in the form of a letter, typed in cold, formal script. "Saw. Your presence has raised concerns among residents. We are re-VYUing your compliance with HOA standards. Saw it wasn't an EVY tie-knot yet, but it was a threat, sharp and deliberate. James stopped Leah VYing the house. He drew the blinds, locked the doors, and let the world outside fade to a murmur. The nightmares worsened flashes of sand and blood, screams he couldn't silence. The walls of his home, once a refuge, felt like a cage closing in. He'd fought for this country, nearly died for it, only to be treated like an intruder in his own life. For the first time since Iraq, he felt truly defeated. Then came the call that changed everything. It was late, the clock ticking past midnight, when his phone buzzed. James hesitated, then picked it up. "Dad." The voice on the other end belonged to his daughter, Emily Carter, a 32-year-old attorney with a fire in her that James had always admired. "You okay?" He exhaled, the weight of it all spilling out in a single breath. "They want to gone him. They're trying to push me out." Silence stretched across the line, but James knew his daughter well enough to sense the storm brewing. When Emily spoke again, her voice was steel. "Let them try. They'll have to go through me first." Emily wasn't just a lawyer, she was a force of nature. She'd built her career taking on corporate bullies and crooked landlords, wielding the law like a weapon. The moment she heard her father's story, something inside her snapped. This wasn't just about James, it was personal. She took a week off work, drove the 3 hours from the city to Willow Creek, and set up camp in her father's Lee VYing room. Laptop open, coffee brewing, she dug into the HOA like a detective on a cold case. What she found was a gold mine of dirt. Willow Creek's HOA had a history of targeting residents who didn't fit Richard's VY shown of perfection. A widow fined for her unkempt flower beds until she sold her home in tears. A young couple harassed over their toddler's tricycle until they packed up and left. An elderly man with a limp, shamed for his unsightly cane, driven out within months. The pattern was clear. The HOA wasn't enforcing rules, it was enforcing exclusion. And now they'd picked the wrong target. Emily knew the law was on her side. The Fair Housing Act protected veterans and people with disabilities from discrimination. The Americans with Disabilities Act shielded her father's PTSD from being weaponized against him. She drafted a lawsuit with surgical precision: unlawful discrimination, harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, retaliation through baseless fines. But she needed more than paper, she needed proof that would hit hard and fast. Her breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A neighbor, Mrs. Larson, a quiet woman who'd lived in Willow Creek for decades, slipped Emily a USB drive one rainy afternoon. "I recorded that meeting," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "I couldn't stand what they did to your dad." Emily plugged it in that night, and there it was, Richard's voice, dripping with venom, mocking James's trauma in front of a room full of witnesses. "Maybe a cabin in the woods," he'd sneered. "Somewhere your episodes won't disturb us." The laughter that followed was the nail in the coffin. Emily didn't hesitate. She uploaded the VY Deo online, tagging veterans groups, local news, anyone who'd listen. Within hours, it went VY-rel. "Twitter uploadet with hashtag te justik for ma te hobuli." Headline screamed, "Saw HOA mocks veterans' PTSD in shocking video." Saw the internet became a tidal wave of outrage, crashing over Willow Creek with unrelenting force. Veterans posted their own stories of mistreatment. Commentators tore Richard apart on live TV. By morning, the story had gone national. Richard and his cronies didn't see it coming. At first, they tried damage control, a limp apology emailed to residents, claiming it was all a misunderstanding. But the public wasn't buying it. Protesters showed up outside the community gates, while VYing signs saw "Honor our heroes, no more HOA tyranny." Saw Richard's name was plastered across every article, his LinkedIn flooded with hate messages. His construction business lost clients overnight. Nobody wanted to touch the scandal. The other board members fared no better, their reputations shredded in the fallout. The next HOA meeting was a massacre. The community center overflowed with residents, many of whom had stayed silent for years. Richard stepped up to speak, but the crowd drowned him out. "Resign," a man shouted. "You're a disgrace," a woman yelled, tears in her eyes. A Vietnam vet in the back stood up, pointing a trembling finger. "I fought for this country, same as him. You don't get to treat us like trash." Richard's face drained of color, his usual swagger gone. The board didn't just lose control, they lost everything. In court, Emily was relentless. She stood before the judge, her voice steady as she played the VY Deo, letting Richard's words echo through the silence. She laid out the HOA's pattern of abuse, case by case, law by law, until the defense had nowhere to hide. Richard sat across the room, eyes downcast, a man watching his empire crumble. When the verdict came guilty of discrimination and harassment, damages awarded, board members ordered to resignate, felt like a gunshot. James exhaled, the tension draining from his shoulders. For the first time in months, he felt free. Outside the courthouse, cameras swarmed. Emily faced them head-on, her chin high. "No one's above the law," she said, her words cutting through the chaos. "Not an HOA, not anyone." The crowd cheered, but James just stood beside her, quiet, letting the moment sink in. He'd won more than a loss with, won his dignity back. Willow Creek changed after that. The old board was gone, replaced by people who actually listened. Neighbors who'd once shunned James now stopped by with casseroles, apologies, stories of their own. A retired Marine down the street clasped his hand one day and said, "You gave us all a voice, brother." Veterans groups reached out, offering support James hadn't known existed. For the first time, he didn't feel like a ghost felt seen. But the ripple effects went further. Emily's phone wouldn't stop ringing calls from strangers across the country, homeowners with their own HOA horror stories. A vet in Ohio fined for his Sayre VYC dog. A widow in Arizona harassed until she lost her home. A family in Oregon targeted for their autistic son's outbursts. Emily hadn't planned on becoming a crusader, but she couldn't turn away. She started taking cases, building a network of lawyers willing to fight the same fight. Richard, meanwhile, vanished. His house went up for sale, his name a stain no one could scrub clean. He left Willow Creek in the dead of night, a king dethroned, while James stayed, rooted in the home he'd fought for. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. A year later, Emily stood at a podium in a packed conference hall, facing hundreds of young lawyers at a housing rights summit. She told her father's story as Sayre VYC, his struggle, their VY tore with a fire that held the room captive. "The law only works if we make it," she said, her voice ringing clear. "Some fights are necessary. Some VY Tories change everything." When a student asked if she'd do it again, Emily smiled, fierce and certain. "In a heartbeat," she said, "because this wasn't just about my dad. It was about every person who's ever been told they don't belong in pro-VYing they do." Back in Willow Creek, James sat on his porch, coffee in hand, watching the sunset paint the sky gold. The neighborhood hummed with life, not fear. He'd served VY Ved, war twice, once overseas, once here. And now, finally, he was home. If you were the one in this story, how would you react? Would you stand up and fight back, or accept the unreasonable pressure and control from the HOA? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this VY Deo with more people. Your small action gives us the motivation to keep bringing you more intense and engaging stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next VY Deo.